The New South Wales Labor government convincingly won the last state election, and it ran hard campaigning on being the party of anti-privatisation. Now, a couple of months into government, it's keeping open the option of selling private or public land to developers to solve the state's housing crisis. Opposition leader Mark Speman joins us live now from Cronulla. Good to see you, Mr Speman. First of all, would you categorise that as privatisation?
Well, I think it does amount to privatisation, and this is an unfortunate trend we're seeing with this government of indicating one thing, telling the voters one thing and then doing another. Before the election, no indication they'd take the razor to infrastructure, to frontline cost of living delivery like active kids vouchers. Then after the election, we have the Premier saying that they won't deal with One Nation, they won't deal with Mark Latham, and yet we see a deal done with One Nation, with Mark Latham, to put Rod Roberts as the Deputy President. Now, having run a scare campaign on privatisation before the election, the big lie about Sydney Water, they now want to privatise public land.
Well, just on that, because I spoke to Chris Minns before the election, put it to him that, you know, this was essentially privatisation. He said that's definitely not the technical definition of it. So would you quibble with that?
Well, that's playing with words. If you have a public asset that is sold to a private developer, that is privatisation. You're handing over public assets to private developers. And privatisation is something that Mr Minns completely ruled out.
OK, well, on Sydney Water, they are trying to put Sydney Water into the Constitution so it can't be sold off by any future government. Is that something you're supporting?
Well, a shadow cabinet will discuss that in the very near future and we'll announce our position. But let me make this very clear. We have never supported the sale of Sydney Water. We ruled that out at the election and we continue not to support the sale of Sydney Water. It's an important public asset that should remain in public hands.
You're wedged here, though. Clearer. They're trying to wedge you here, though. If you don't support, if you make that clear, why not put it in the Constitution? Well,
it's a bit of a stunt, to be honest, Laura.
It is a stunt, but they might have you on this.
It is a stunt. Well, I don't think we're wedged, Laura. We have made our position very clear. We oppose the sale of Sydney Water, for Hunter Water for that matter. That is crystal clear. Labor went to the election on a big lie on election day, and beforehand there were posters up everywhere saying save Sydney Water. Sydney Water was never going to be sold. It was never going to be privatised, and that remains our position.
Why not put it in the Constitution then?
Well, that's something that Shadow Cabinet will consider very quickly, but it really makes no practical difference because we've made it very clear that we do not support the sale of Sydney Water. OK.
Now, you've declared a free vote for the New South Wales Liberals on the Voice, but isn't that walking back a commitment Dominic Perrottet made, or his position, before the election?
No. Premier Perrottet, as he then was, supported a voice to Parliament in principle. So two qualifications there. First, in principle, and second, a voice to Parliament. What we now have is a proposal for a voice to the executive as well. We've seen the detail of the wording. It's been subject to a parliamentary committee process, so the circumstances have changed since Dominic stated his position in principle.
You're a big legal mind, and you've no doubt looked at these details here. Do you personally support the Voice as it is at the moment?
Well, what I've said is I'm sympathetic to the idea of a voice. It is potentially something that has nation-building consequences and could be a big step for reconciliation. But I have been concerned about the wording. There has been now a parliamentary committee report. I haven't had the chance to examine that in detail, but I propose to do so before I say anything further. OK, so what's your kind of in-principle position then? Are you concerned about what's very much in the public arena? What do you have to look at more in detail? And is there a chance that you could campaign against it? I don't contemplate at the moment campaigning one way or the other, but I will state a public position when I've had the chance to digest the parliamentary committee report. I want to make sure that something that is sound in principle, has the potential to be nation-building, is sufficiently practical and flexible for good public policy outcomes and for Indigenous people in particular. And there are a number of public concerns about the wording of the proposal at the moment. There's a dissenting report by the Parliamentary Committee and I want to look at that in detail before I can comment further.
OK, we look forward to talking to you after we see that committee report. I want to ask you about Mark Latham. You raised him at the start of this interview, said Labor's done a deal with One Nation in New South Wales. You haven't ruled out doing deals or working with Mark Latham, have you? Why not?
Well, Mark Latham he's a democratically elected member of the Legislative Council. We have to respect the will of the electors and vote with everyone who's been democratically elected. I have condemned his homophobic comments as reprehensible. He should show some courage and apologise to Alex Greenwich, but in the meantime, we have to work with everyone who's been elected. But what I won't do is engage in the hypocrisy that Labor has engaged in, trying to occupy the high moral ground, saying they won't deal with Mark Latham, and yet we know they have dealt with him. They have dealt with him to secure a deputy presidency for Rod Roberts to give them the advantage on the floor of the Legislative Council. They have dealt with Mark Latham to stymie the Legislative Council as a house of review.
But what about your role as the opposition leader? I mean, by dealing with him, you essentially, I get that he's democratically elected, but don't you provide him some cover for his views that he's doubled down on? I mean, what do you think of those views that he's expressed?
Well, I've just said they are reprehensible. It was an appalling comment. It's unbecoming of a Member of Parliament. He should show some courage and resign, admit he has said and done the wrong thing. But I will disagree with the Legalised Cannabis Party. There'll be occasions when I disagree with the Greens and others. It doesn't mean you can't deal with them. We're there. We've been elected. The electors expect us to do a job with everyone who's been elected for 4 years. But what I won't do is engage in the hypocrisy of Labor, saying they won't deal with Mark Latham when in fact they have. And they've done that for the reprehensible purpose of stymieing the Legislative Council as a house of review. They don't apparently want to be accountable for their legislation. They want to make sure they've got the numbers of the floor of the Legislative Council to stymie review. So what they've done is done a deal with Mark Latham. OK, one final question to you on the active kids vouchers. These were cash handouts under the previous government. Do you think they should really remain? Absolutely. They were important cost of living measures when families are doing it hard with high inflation, the highest inflation we've had for 40 years, inflation that's higher than any of the G7 countries. And they're also important to get kids out and active. We know that something like 70% of our children are not meeting the daily minimum recommended requirements for exercise. 22% of them are obese. It's important to get these kids active, away from digital devices, on playing fields, being physically active and healthy. So it's imperative from their well-being, from their health and for family cost of living that these measures continue.
Well, if they're so good, why did the previous government have them expiring at the end of June and not put more money in the budget for them?
Well, we made it very clear we were going to roll over active kids. We wouldn't have announced being able to cash in creative kids vouchers for active kids purposes. We wouldn't have expanded the criteria for active kids rebates to cover school holiday programs unless we intended to roll over the program.
Mark Speakman, good to talk to you this morning. Thanks so much. We'll speak to you after we get that committee report on The Voice too.
The report's out. I just haven't had a chance to look at it in detail, Laura. Yeah,
fair enough. When you read it, we'll speak to you again.
Okay.
We'll speak to your office. My people will speak to your people. Mark Speakman there, live in Cronulla.